Hey everyone, this is Aamer from Toronto, and we're back.
Hi, this is Erin, and welcome to Das Criminal.
Another week gone by in this quarantine, and another week for you guys to hear our beautiful voices.
Yeah, we hope that we are keeping you entertained, doing our part. Aamer works in the healthcare sector, so...
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained? I mean, you can't see me, but I've waved my arms like, what's his name, Russell Crowe in Gladiator.
We should probably mention to you that this episode was voted on by our Patreon subscribers. So we put up a couple topics and they pretty unanimously, I think, chose this one. So here it is.
God bless direct democracy. And before we start, there is a warning. We will be discussing sensitive topics today, including transgressions against marginalized people, medical discrimination, and drug use. So if you are sensitive to those topics, and that's okay, you might want to skip this episode.
Today's topic is probably one of our most controversial yet. It involves prejudice, fear-mongering, and the ambiguous gray area between what is morally and what is legally wrong. And let's be real here, there's a lot of stigma around HIV and AIDS, and many people feel uncomfortable discussing it. But we here at Das Criminal don't shy away from contentious issues, nor do we believe that HIV is a shameful topic that needs to be soft-pedaled or avoided. I will be totally honest here. When I was conducting the research for this episode, I had to ask myself a few times whether what I was reading was based in peer-reviewed research or dubious moralizing. So please keep an open mind when you're listening.
Yeah, so rather than just diving into the cases and our assessments of them without addressing some myths and biases we may be carrying, we're first going to talk about HIV, what it is, how it's transmitted, and how far medical sciences have come in the past few decades. Then we can have a more informed discussion about the criminalization of HIV transmission and its implications for public health. And of course, we're going to give you some cases to mull over.
So first, let's dive into the sex ed that you probably never really got in high school. HIV is a virus, which, if left untreated, will eventually cause AIDS. These terms are sometimes mistakenly used interchangeably, but they are not synonymous. HIV stands for Human Immunodeficiency Virus, and AIDS stands for Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome.
It's actually quite similar to COVID-19, where the virus that actually causes the disease is called coronavirus, as you may have heard. And the syndrome, the collection of symptoms the virus causes, is COVID-19. So patients come into contact with coronavirus, and the disease they get is COVID-19. Now, HIV affects the body by taking over the CD4 cells or T cells, which are part of the immune system. It turns these cells into factories to produce copies of the virus, and over time, the entire immune system becomes weaker. The gradual depletion of CD4 cells in the blood is measured in stages, and the fourth and final stage, with the lowest CD4 count, is called AIDS. People with AIDS have extremely weakened immune systems and are susceptible to highly fatal illnesses that people without AIDS are much less likely to get. Or even diseases that would otherwise be non-fatal to healthy people, like the flu, would be devastating and possibly deadly to people with AIDS.
Most people who are HIV positive will never progress to AIDS. Outside of a few experimental cases, there is not yet a cure for HIV, but recent advances in antiretroviral medications, or ARVs, have allowed people living with HIV to live long and healthy lives. You've probably heard this said before, HIV is not a death sentence. Unlike airborne illnesses, HIV cannot survive outside bodily fluids. These are blood, semen, vaginal fluid, and breast milk. Because of this, the virus can be transmitted from person to person through blood transfusions, needle sharing, sexual intercourse, and pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding.
However, HIV cannot be spread through tears, sweat, saliva, feces, or urine, or through insect bites. There is zero chance of you contracting HIV simply by being around someone who is HIV positive. Hugging, kissing, shaking hands, and sharing things like eating utensils, exercise equipment, water fountains, and toilets do not spread HIV.
Yeah, so basically, just like living near someone with HIV, unless you're sleeping with that person, you're not going to get it. And I shouldn't even say sleeping with, having sex with.
I mean, yeah, like you could literally be sleeping in the same bed and not contract it. Like, I know though, like, it's weird. One of the things we might get into later, fear and paranoia towards HIV positive individuals. I know back home in the Middle East, there was like a scare in the mid 2000s, late 2000s of like contracting HIV because someone sat at a toilet that you're going to use or something.
Yeah, I mean, that's also what happens when sex ed is not very good and you have people asking questions like, can I get pregnant from a toilet seat? No, you cannot. Don't worry about that.
Yeah.
Biologically speaking, HIV does not discriminate. People of all races, genders, social classes, sexual orientations, and experiences can contract the virus. Sociologically, however, certain groups are most likely to bear the weight of bloodborne infectious illnesses. These are poor people, whether they be people living in quote unquote poor countries or rich countries, the poor people of rich countries, IV drug users and their sex partners, sex workers and their sex partners, men who have sex with men, though globally more women than men are living with HIV, and in some regions, women who experience physical or sexual violence are 150% more likely to become infected with HIV. Trans women are also a group specifically at risk, and geographically speaking, East and Southern Africa have the most cases of HIV.
So because we know how it spreads, and it spreads in a limited manner of ways, there are steps we can all take to prevent the transmission of HIV between people. For example, with blood transfusions, they're currently tested for HIV as well as other bloodborne illnesses. Medical technology has come a long way to allow doctors and scientists to make sure blood is safe before it's received by a patient. According to the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, your risk of getting HIV from blood transfusion in the United States is lower than your risk of getting killed by lightning, fewer than 1 in a million. For pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding, again, with current ARVs and formula feeding instead of breastfeeding, the rate of transmission of HIV from mother to child drops drastically. Incidentally, Cuba was the first country in the world to eliminate mother to child transmission of HIV and syphilis in 2015.
What? You mean to tell me that socialized medicine is good?
Maybe the reason they can't afford real cheese on their pizza and put condoms on their pizza is because they spend all their money on healthcare.
Maybe that's how they stopped HIV transmission. So another way to prevent the spread of HIV, do not share needles with other people. If you are getting a tattoo or a piercing, for the love of God, make sure they open a sterile needle in front of you. They should be doing this. Every time I've gotten a piercing, they have taken the needle out of this little package and I have seen them do it. I don't think this is the risk that it used to be because we now know how dangerous it is to share needles. But if for some reason your friend is giving you a stick and poke tattoo, make sure it's a new needle and it's sterilized first. Because of this, the most vulnerable people to contracting HIV through needle sharing are IV drug users. Some people and politicians are against clinics distributing clean needles. But how about, instead of hopping on our moral high horse and judging people with addiction, we take an evidence-based approach to public health and try to help everyone be the safest they can be? That's basically the message of this episode.
I mean, we support that, but unfortunately this clashes with the dominant political discourse of punishment, a discourse that actually stems from white Protestantism, where there is a sort of underlying ideology that people who are addicted to substances are morally corrupt and therefore must suffer for their behavior. Even though I'm pretty sure if Jesus returned today, the first thing he would do is open a safe injection site and turn water into naloxone.
There's a thread throughout certain ideas that will come up against that we disagree with, that people who contract HIV are being punished for something, that this is something they deserve. And that's just not a helpful way to look at it. Setting your morals aside, it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
So another way that HIV can be spread is through sexual intercourse. Anal and vaginal sex can transmit HIV, but according to the CDC, there is little to no risk of getting or transmitting HIV from oral sex. There are several ways to prevent HIV transmission from sex. First, use condoms. Second, you can take something called PrEP, or pre-exposure prophylaxis. This is a daily medication that can significantly reduce your risk of contracting HIV. So if you think you might be at risk, you can ask your doctor. Another option is to take PEP, or post-exposure prophylaxis. This is basically like Plan B, but for HIV. If the regimen is started within 72 hours of potentially being exposed to HIV, it will reduce your chances of becoming HIV positive.
For people who are living with HIV who take medication to reduce their viral load to an undetectable amount, we label them as U, which is undetectable or untransmittable. And that means that the viral load is unable to transmit the disease to another person. Also, get tested and encourage your partner to get tested for HIV and other STIs. If you're both HIV negative in a monogamous relationship and not at risk of contracting HIV another way like sharing needles, you cannot contract HIV. Of course, this does involve an element of trust.
From a public health perspective, the best way to prevent the spread of HIV is testing. Even if you don't think you're particularly at risk, it's a good idea to ask for an HIV test at your annual checkup, because if you do have HIV, the sooner you can get on a medication regimen that works for you, the better. Plus, knowing you are HIV positive can allow you to take steps to ensure that you don't transmit the virus to other people. This is why science-based sex ed is so important. My high school health teacher, for instance, told us that condoms aren't really effective at preventing STIs and pregnancy. I think the abstinence-only dweebs in my district thought that lying about this would prevent teenagers from engaging in sex, but I think this would cause more problems because the thought process here is, if condoms are ineffective, why bother with them?
I mean, I don't recall being taught about sex in the practical sense in school either. I mean, we only had abstractions where there were like genitalia diagrams in health textbooks. And in class, we went through the biological minutia of fertilization. But we never really covered things like STIs or the transmission of STIs and modes of protection and so on. I also think sex should be treated in the same way as alcohol. Prohibition of alcohol didn't reduce alcohol consumption. It just pushed it underground, where people would drink bootlegged alcohol mixed with methanol, which would cause blindness and death. People will drink, people will have sex. The approach should be harm reduction, not punitive banning orders or fear-mongering.
Yeah, we had to watch this awful woman. Her name is Pam Stenzel. You can look up her stuff online. And she does a lot of religious abstinence-only classes and videos and stuff like that. But we had the so-called secular version. And we watched this video where she was like very angrily saying to this group of teenagers, like, if you've had sex, anal, vaginal, or oral, don't you dare say you're a virgin. Which, first of all, virginity really is a social construct. But second of all, in a group of teenagers, some of them have already had sex, and at least one of them in that group has probably been raped or sexually abused. And like, who are you to get up in front of the room and act like this person has lost something or is dirty or worth less? That is a horrible thing to say.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite grim. Also, like, I don't know about you, but remembering when I was a teenager in school, like, being a virgin wasn't exactly something people aspire to. I don't think she understands how teenagers think.
I mean, who cares, honestly? If you are ready to make that decision and you are informed and you choose to have sex, that is your business. And if you choose not to have sex, that's also your business. And neither makes you a better person.
Yeah.
It's just a decision that you make. Kind of in the same vein, abstinence-only sex ed has been shown over and over again not to work at preventing unwanted pregnancy and the spread of STIs. It stresses this specific brand of moral idealism while ignoring the very practical fact that we are humans and humans often have sex and associated desires. Plus, LGBT-inclusive sex ed is severely lacking in many places. I've read some blamey and shamey comments suggesting that people who are exposed to HIV through sex know the risks and are therefore responsible, but I don't think that's entirely true, because if top-down laws and policies regarding HIV are outdated and lacking medical bases, as we're about to discuss, then how can we expect the average person, and especially the average teenager, to be super well informed about HIV? So let's get into what we mean when we say HIV transmission has become criminalized. In many countries and jurisdictions, a person thought to intentionally or recklessly transmit HIV to another person could face criminal prosecution. In some cases, where an HIV-positive person is thought to expose another to the virus, but the virus doesn't actually spread, they might still be criminally charged. For example, in some places, an HIV-positive person who has sex with other people without disclosing their status could be prosecuted, even if the virus is not transmitted. These are sometimes referred to as non-disclosure laws.
According to a 2015 article by Canadian professor Eric Michalowski in the Journal of Critical Public Health, as of 2010, 63 countries have declared HIV-specific laws, 41 countries had prosecuted people living with HIV for HIV non-disclosure, exposure, and transmission using either general or HIV-specific criminal laws, and the United States and Canada in particular have prosecuted hundreds of people for HIV transmission.
Now, we know what a lot of you are probably thinking. Knowingly exposing someone to an incurable virus is a shitty thing to do, and people who do shitty things deserve to be punished. This isn't an uncommon idea, but it's not the one held by experts on the subject. As Dr. Stephen R. Latham, director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics at Yale University notes, quote, "There is widespread consensus among experts that criminalizing HIV status is counterproductive from a public health point of view." End quote. Criminalization of HIV transmission leads to a decrease in testing, which in turn abets the spread of the virus, as most people who pass it on to other people do so before they know they're HIV positive.
For instance, a peer-reviewed study led by Maya A. Kessler of the University of Toronto found that fear of future prosecution led some men who have sex with men to avoid HIV testing. Researchers concluded that this trend could potentially lead to an 18.5% increase in HIV transmission.
Writing for The Body, New York-based ACT UP organizer Jason Rosenberg points out, quote, "We know that there is 0% of transmission sexually from a person who is on successful HIV treatment. We know that individuals will be less likely to transmit HIV if they know their status, and we know that PrEP is 99% effective to stop the transmission of HIV. We also know that through active criminalization laws, individuals are less likely to get tested out of fear of having HIV. Additionally, people living with HIV who are in criminalization states fear seeking treatment, which is not only a detriment to their own health, but also to public health, because as a result, HIV continues to spread. If anything, active HIV criminalization laws enable and breed stigma and discrimination against people living with HIV and the communities disproportionately affected by it." End quote. Internationally, the Joint UN Program on HIV/AIDS also urges that only those who deliberately infect other people should face criminal prosecution. Rather than blaming or punishing people who are HIV positive, it is most effective from a public health perspective to encourage testing and treatment.
And now we get to the fun part. We're going to break into some proper cases. If you're interested in researching these yourselves, the HIV Justice Network has a website that catalogs cases of criminal HIV transmission by country and by circumstance, which is where we found a few of these.
Our first case comes out of Russia in 2019 with the newspaper headline, "HIV-infected mother on trial for breastfeeding in St. Petersburg." According to the article, an unnamed woman living with HIV gave birth to a child in a hospital and then tried to breastfeed the baby.
Now, we know that breastfeeding can transmit HIV from mother to child. The baby in this case did not contract HIV, but was removed from the mother's care, and the mother could spend up to a year in prison for deliberately putting another person in danger of becoming infected with HIV. The woman in this case, however, regrettably, wasn't very educated on HIV transmission and didn't understand that she could pass the virus to her child through breastfeeding. Once she realized the risk, she began seeking medical treatment and counseling, and pledged to provide the best care for her child. But her baby has already been taken away.
I think this case is a prime example of the problems with prioritizing criminalization over education. Clearly, this woman did not initially have the resources to understand HIV transmission and the risks with breastfeeding. But once given those resources, she immediately apologized for possibly exposing her child and sought help to keep her baby safe and healthy. Why should she be a criminal? Who is made safer by locking her up? This case also made me think about how pregnant people are sometimes treated as incubators, and how the concept of what Michel Foucault calls biopower, or the anatopolitics of the human body, are so prevalent here. Foucault himself died of an AIDS-related illness in 1984 at the beginning of the outbreak. Let's look at, for example, the consumption of alcohol during pregnancy. Most of us know that alcohol exposure during pregnancy risks causing a spectrum of physical, intellectual, and cognitive disabilities known as fetal alcohol syndrome. And I think most of us would agree that drinking if you know you are pregnant and intend to carry the pregnancy to term is irresponsible for this reason. But should mothers of children with fetal alcohol syndrome face criminal prosecution? I certainly don't think so. Consider first of all that many women who might drink while pregnant don't even know that they're pregnant, especially early on in the pregnancy. And in many of these cases, once the woman discovers that she is pregnant, she will stop drinking for the remainder of the pregnancy. Additionally, the National Organization on Fetal Alcohol Syndrome in the United States specifically advocates against policies that criminalize maternal alcohol consumption. Its website states, quote, "Laws that seek to discourage alcohol use during pregnancy through criminalization may reduce the likelihood that a pregnant woman would disclose her alcohol use to her doctor for fear of criminal sanction. NOFAS is opposed to statutes that interfere with a patient-doctor relationship or seek to remand a woman to treatment services without consideration of her dependents." End quote. In many ways, this mirrors our discussion of HIV. Rather than stigmatizing and criminalizing a medical problem, we can benefit public health by fostering campaigns of awareness, testing, and treatment. Additionally, just as criminalizing maternal alcohol consumption reduces a pregnant person to an incubator rather than a full, autonomous human being, criminalizing HIV transmission reduces people living with HIV to disease vectors. In both cases, people viewed as having the potential to cause harm to another are seen as bodies to be policed. Even setting aside the ethical implications of such concentrated biopower, though criminalization of medical problems like HIV transmission and fetal alcohol syndrome may lead to some people being punished, it actually has a negative overall effect on public health as it increases instances of these medical conditions. So if the intention is to reduce HIV transmission rates through criminalization, that goal is not being realized.
Now, that case we started with a very sort of easy case to moralize on. Like, it was very wrong.
Yeah, it's just sad. Yeah.
It's very sad. The woman didn't know. It was primarily a case of ignorance. And once she was educated, she was very remorseful. And they took her child away, which I think is extremely unfair and excessive.
And unhelpful.
Yeah, it's completely reductive. And it doesn't help anyone. Like, I don't understand. Like, what is it supposed to achieve?
Yeah, and I think in the case of fetal alcohol syndrome as well, like we said, most women that consume alcohol during pregnancy do so before they realize they're pregnant. And then once they realize they're pregnant, if they intend to carry that pregnancy, they stop drinking. But if a woman doesn't stop drinking, it's indicative of a serious mental health problem.
Yeah.
Like, if I found out I was pregnant and wanted to carry the baby to term, I would stop drinking. Like, that's something that I would do. And the only reason that I wouldn't is if I didn't plan to have the child or if I had an addiction. And that's a much bigger problem than the pregnancy itself.
Yeah, addiction at this point is not a criminal issue, it's a social issue, and it should be treated as such. I think the bigger problem with that as well is, like, it seems like retroactive punishment to the mother, like, oh, you did so and so wrong, so we have to punish you punitively. It's very punitive.
Right. And what if because alcohol is often a form of self-medication for people that do have an addiction, what if you take other medications during your pregnancy and you don't even know they're bad? Like, taking certain antidepressants while pregnant can cause issues to the fetus or the baby. Should we fault those people as well?
Yeah. Not everyone should be expected to have the knowledge of a doctor, like a medical doctor.
Right. What if you're pregnant and you're in a car accident that you caused and you lose the fetus? Like, it's just such a slippery slope.
Yeah. And this is especially true of, like, places, especially, like, for example, in America, where there is no universal healthcare. So prenatal care is very inconsistent. So, like, how do we expect mothers or mothers to be to have all the knowledge of how to behave while pregnant to have a healthy fetus or a healthy baby, and not give them the sort of medical services they need to achieve that.
And in a lot of these places, El Salvador is actually really notorious for it. A young woman who miscarries a child will sometimes be charged with illegal abortion.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I've read about that. Yeah.
Really so you're just criminalizing all sorts of things through pregnancy, and you're using it as a way to turn a woman into an incubator and police her body and say if she's not pregnant correctly, you're going to punish her.
Yeah, it's her fault. Like, everything is her fault. She's not a good enough incubator.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the next case is a lot more messy, for lack of a better word.
Agreed.
So even if we've convinced you so far that criminalizing HIV transmission is not constructive to public health, you might be thinking, okay, but what about the people who deliberately transmit HIV? The people who are educated and have access to resources but which willfully spread HIV anyways. We wish we could tell you that's something that never happens. To be clear, it's certainly something that rarely happens. As former director of the McGill University AIDS Center Mark Weinberg noted, whenever there is a sensational criminal case involving HIV transmission, the media cover it with far more gusto than they usually devote to scientific advances in the field. We'll use as an example the highly publicized case of Daryll Rowe, a Scottish man with HIV who on more than one occasion discreetly removed or sabotaged a condom before having sex with other men. Daryll would then wait several days or weeks, presumably until PEP would no longer be effective, and then send taunting messages to these men like, quote, "I got you, burn, you have it," end quote. While not all of his sex partners became HIV positive, some did. The case was highly publicized, and the BBC even made a documentary feature on Daryll's behavior called "The Man Who Used HIV as a Weapon." Daryll was convicted at Brighton Crown Court on 5 counts of causing grievous bodily harm, GBH, and 5 of attempted GBH. He was given a life sentence with a minimum of 12 years, which in England means he'll be eligible for parole after 12 years, but that it won't necessarily be granted. The case of Daryll Rowe complicates our discussion of HIV criminalization because it is the daunting exception to the trends we've examined. Daryll knew he was HIV positive. He chose not to take the medication to reduce his viral load, even at the expense of his own health. He didn't disclose this information to his sex partners. He deceived some of them into believing they were having protected sex with a condom, when really they weren't, and then sent them jeering and taunting messages about being infected with HIV.
I don't think it's any exaggeration to suggest that Daryll deliberately put the health and safety of other gay men at risk, and that he needs some serious psychological help which unfortunately he didn't seek or receive before these events. And I think we can all agree that what Daryll did was morally wrong and indicates a severe lack of empathy on his part. It reminds me in some ways of the attitude of a school shooter, like, if I'm going down, I'm taking all of you with me, that kind of really messed up mindset. And it also indicates that Daryll probably suffers from some degree of self-loathing, and he's projecting that onto other men. Legally, however, I don't know if I agree that HIV transmission itself should be a crime, as this further stigmatizes people living with HIV, especially those in the most vulnerable communities like migrants, sex workers, LGBT people, and people with addictions, who likewise agree with us that Daryll's actions are absolutely abhorrent. I do think, however, that Daryll should be held responsible for his sexual assault on these other men, as he did something colloquially known as stealthing, or secretly removing a condom after the other person has consented to sex with a condom. Whether or not the perpetrator risks passing on any STI or causing pregnancy through this act, it is a violation and a breach of informed consent to remove protection that has been agreed upon. Dr. Weinberg stresses, let's not confuse the issue of HIV testing and personal responsibility for consensual sexual relations with that of HIV transmission by rapists or other perpetrators of crime. Clearly, people who sexually assault others and force them into non-consensual sex should continue to be charged and tried under the law. But the punitive crime in such cases would be assault rather than intent to transmit HIV.
This is a very tough case for me. The problem with Daryll is that he consciously and deliberately acted with the intent to spread HIV. And now, while I'm very skeptical of criminalization as a rehabilitative process, I also disagree here in that I believe Daryll should be prosecuted for his intent to transmit HIV. For me personally, this is no different than a person going around COVID-19 and intentionally coughing in people's faces or on surfaces to spread the disease. And here I think that the approach should be to minimize harm on the community as a whole, which for me means at least keeping Daryll away from others, because I'm not quite sure how else we can guarantee that he won't continue to weaponize his HIV to hurt others.
Yeah, I completely agree that it seems like Daryll has some significant mental health issues and that he is a danger to himself and to others. And I actually think in some way this provides a case that other people, especially those who don't pose a threat to the safety of others, they don't belong in prison. Someone who is arrested and charged with dealing drugs or not paying a fine or something like that, they go to prison. And one of the places that HIV often spreads to marginalized groups is in prisons. So if we agree that Daryll is a danger to other people, which I totally think he is, then why should other quote unquote criminals be subjected to him? Why should they have to be around them? Is prison the place for Daryll to get the therapy that he so clearly needs while not being able to harm other people? And I don't think solitary confinement is an ethical thing either. So I honestly don't know.
Yeah, neither do I. It's really messy, really complicated. I don't know what I think about this, and I kind of hate it because I usually know my position on things, and this is very complicated and I feel very undecided.
I think it's worth noting here too that Daryll specifically targeted other gay men. He was gay, so that is his pool of, possible sexual partners, but still he sought out other people who may be marginalized for their sexual orientation and actively tried to make their lives worse.
Yeah, I would argue the same. The stealthing is sexual assault and should be prosecuted as such. But then what about someone who lies about his HIV status in order to achieve unprotected sex with a partner, even a long-term partner, and spreads HIV that way?
Yeah, we will discuss this later on in our closing notes, but I just think generally if you have to lie to get people to have sex with you that you believe otherwise would not have sex with you, that is bad. I don't know if it should all be criminal, but I think we can pretty much all agree that you are not a good person for doing that.
Yeah.
A similar recent case comes out of Canada, that of Clato Mabior. Clato, who had moved to Canada from South Sudan, was found guilty on 6 counts of criminal HIV exposure in 2008 and sentenced to 14 years in prison. He was later deported from Canada. Clato was HIV positive, but unlike Daryll Rowe, he stuck to his medication regimen and had an undetectable viral load count, meaning he didn't actually transmit HIV to any of the women and girls he was accused of exposing. That isn't to say that Clato Mabior isn't a sex predator. Actually, the victims in this case were runaway girls as young as 12 who Mabior lured away from a shelter with promises of drugs and alcohol. At this time, Clato was in his late 20s and early 30s. So, why he was charged with criminal HIV exposure rather than statutory rape is baffling to me. He's dangerous not because of his HIV status, as he had an undetectable viral load, meaning he couldn't pass it on, but because he exploits vulnerable young girls for sex. Instead of stigmatizing people living with HIV, we should be stigmatizing actual rapists. Clato Mabior is a perpetrator of violence, even if he didn't have HIV.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, my position on this case is different from Daryll because, unlike Daryll, who actively sought to spread his HIV to the point of not taking any steps to reduce his own viral count, Clato seems to be actively acting to treat his HIV by sticking with his medication. That being said, I agree with you, Erin, in that I believe he should have been prosecuted for statutory rape given his exploitation of minors. I also find the deportation following his sentence disturbing in its own right. I mean, I believe a person should be prosecuted in an area where a crime is committed, but if they do serve their sentence accordingly, I don't understand why citizenship and the lack thereof should then be further used for punitive punishment. In this particular case, Clato is a rapist and a sex pest. But I worry about deportation being weaponized against immigrants who may be political dissidents, being deported if they act against their host government. So, for example, immigrants standing in solidarity actions with Wet'suwet'en protests in Canada or in the North Dakota pipeline protests in America.
Yeah, if you look up these cases as well on the HIV Justice Network or HIV Worldwide, it's so racialized and especially biased against migrants. And this is such a common xenophobic trope that migrants are bringing disease and they're here to infect white people. It's really, really awful. And I mean, I think what Clato did, I think he's a rapist. I don't question that. But again, he was taking his medication. I suppose, on a technicality, exposed people to HIV, but he really didn't because they were not at risk of getting it. He should be charged for exploiting young girls.
Yeah, but also, he's charged, sentenced accordingly, found guilty, sentenced, and serves his sentence. I don't understand why deportation has to be a thing as well.
It's also just a really common dog whistle. First of all, immigrants, statistically speaking, do not commit more crimes than native-born people in really any part of the world. But the idea that if immigrants weren't here, crime would just go away is asinine, absolutely asinine. There are plenty of native-born rapists, hate to break it to you. So there's further moral gray area in the matters of disclosure and consent, and the extent to which policy should be an instrument to enforce public health versus a system to deter or punish those who might put others in harm's way. Some philosophers, like Foucault for instance, often see little difference in practice. Yale professor Stephen Latham writes,
"In the absence of evidence that a person intends harm to others, it is morally wrong to subject that person to criminal prosecution on the basis of his or her disease status. It is also highly questionable for government to second-guess the decision of adults on sexual matters. The vast majority of HIV-related prosecutions involve consensual sexual relations between adults. We know that people at high risk for HIV routinely have unprotected sex even if they know that their partners may become HIV infected. We know also that HIV-positive people do not always tell potential partners about their HIV status. But it is wrong to infer any intent to harm others from these poor decisions. The fears, insecurities, and power relations that give rise to such decisions are complex. Adding a threat of law enforcement to the mix can enhance those fears, play on those insecurities, and warp those relations, and not always in ways that will better the public's health."
Whether you agree with Latham's interpretation or not, if our goal is to reduce HIV transmission, and peer-reviewed studies repeatedly show that criminalization is a hindrance to that end, then I don't think criminalization is the solution. Just as I believe that handing out masks to combat COVID-19 is a better answer than locking people up who don't social distance or don't understand what social distancing means, I think that free condoms and syringes, education, testing, counseling, and medication is probably the most effective way to mitigate the spread of HIV. But I do think that knowingly misleading a partner about a sexually transmitted infection in order to start or continue a sexual relationship is indeed a poor decision, as Latham pens. Part of informed and enthusiastic consent means understanding the health risks that may or may not be associated with sexual activity. And if you know you are at risk at transmitting HIV and you withhold that information, I think it's a morally shitty thing to do.
Yeah, I think it's important to note here that certain information, like STI status, is reasonably understood to have an impact on informed consent. Thus, I think there should be a discussion about omitting information that would otherwise affect consent versus information that would not be reasonably relevant to a sexual encounter.
Right, and I think cheating on a monogamous partner is also a morally shitty thing to do. But I don't think that adultery should be a criminal offense. In this circumstance, however, there is an argument that if a person knowingly risks transmitting HIV to another person, that there is a possibility of harm, like physical, medical harm, whether or not that is the intention. And in parts of the world where medication is not accessible or not affordable, HIV can still be a persistent health problem. And I also think when we talk about informed consent, you kind of see this straw man argument come up in people where they say oh, so do I have to tell my partner if I'm left-handed because they might not like that? No, because I can't think of a human being on earth who wants to have sex with someone and then would change their mind for a reason like that. And I'm not saying certain things. I think if you lie about your age and commit statutory rape, then yeah, like that is a criminal offense. But let's say you're 40 and you say that you're 34 to get with someone in their 20s. Should it be illegal? No. But is it shady and like debatably really immoral? Of course. Come on.
Yeah, it's definitely immoral, but I don't think criminalization would be the answer to that. Like, what does throwing that person in jail achieve besides some sort of very biblical need for punishment and suffering as a consequence?
Right. If I found out that the person I was dating was like married to someone else and didn't tell me, I would end the relationship and feel like really betrayed and horrible and probably like want that person to get some sort of comeuppance, not like prison, but I'd hope that their marriage would end because they're like a shitty person, you know?
If you found that out, do you think it's your duty to tell the wife?
I think it depends. I have actually, I have been not in a marriage, but like I have gone on a couple dates with someone who was dating someone else and I had no idea. And then I found out and like ended it, obviously.
Did you tell the girlfriend?
Well, I found out because I met her.
Oh. Was it like a completely random meet?
I'm not going to get into like details of my personal life, but I will say she was like really mad at me. And I was like, girl, I didn't know. You should be mad at him. We should both be mad at him. I'm saying we should get together and like put a hex on him. But she was just like yelling at me.
Yeah, that's really, it's always weird. Like, even in the movies and stuff, like when someone cheats on someone, it's often like the person who's being cheated on is often more angry at the third party. And I don't understand why. I mean, it's cognitive dissonance, right? If you love someone and you like, or you're at least you want the relationship to continue, it's way easier to blame a third party that can easily be excised out of the life than to confront the fact that your partner betrayed you.
To be honest, I didn't even think about it until now. We were writing this episode. Like, it doesn't affect me, but it obviously is going to affect him at some point in his life if that's the kind of person he is.
Yeah.
It's going to come back to bite him. I just hope it doesn't wreck an entire family of like children and stuff who have nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
So discussing telling your partner and intent to harm. In a legal sense, intent to harm is not necessary in certain criminal cases. Charges like reckless endangerment with depraved indifference to human life, involuntary manslaughter, and negligent homicide don't require intent. That's basically what separates involuntary manslaughter from other charges, intent itself. Take, for example, someone charged with a DUI. Even if the driver has not caused an accident or harmed anyone else, operating a vehicle with a blood alcohol content over a certain limit is a crime because it significantly increases the risk of fatal or injurious accidents. A key difference here, however, is that studies have shown that stricter criminalization of drinking and driving has led to a decrease in alcohol-related traffic fatalities. So in this case, criminalization seems to act as a deterrent, whereas in the case of HIV, it's not possible to say the same. And there's also the significant difference of like, you live in your body, but you're not always driving a car, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, we shouldn't criminalize people for their state of existence. If you drink alcohol and then you make the choice to get in the car, that is bad. I think we can all agree that's bad. Additionally, the bioethical questions of the extent to which the state or community should force public health initiatives on its populations incorporates concerns about personal liberty versus collective wellness. Should the refusal to vaccinate on ideological grounds be a criminal offense? Especially since it might endanger immunocompromised individuals who depend on herd immunity to stay safe? This actually just occurred to me that I actually do have a health condition where I, to some extent, depend on the honesty of other people to get me through. Aamer knows, and my good friends know, I have a really severe peanut allergy. And while I understand that my allergy and keeping myself away from peanuts is a personal responsibility, and like I have to carry an EpiPen, I have to not eat things I shouldn't be eating. If I go to a party at Aamer's house and he has brownies and I say like, hey, Aamer, are there peanuts in the brownies? There are 3 possible answers, which are yes, no, I don't know. And if he says yes or I don't know, I'm not going to eat those because I could die. But if he says no and then like snickers to himself, knowing that there's peanut butter in the brownies, he's a bad person.
I'm rubbing my hands right now like like the happy merchant caricature.
Right, and it's not the best analogy, but I think it does illustrate, yes, my personal health and safety and avoiding my allergen is my responsibility. But if I take steps to avoid it, like saying, "Hey, Aamer, are there peanuts in your brownies?" Or, "Hey, person who I'm about to have sex with, have you had an STI test? Do you know if you have any STIs?" And that person says no, and they know that the answer is yes, that's putting my safety at risk.
Yeah, I mean, are there peanuts in those brownies, or are you just happy to see me?
Shut up.
But no, it's not just like at a party. It's like if you go to a restaurant and you tell them, okay, I'm allergic to so and so, and I can't, like, you trust that the restaurant will take measures to make sure your dish is free of that allergen. But there's a level of trust there, like a chef at one particular point, a cook could not give any fucks and be like, I don't care, I'm not gonna wash this knife, and peanuts fall onto the fucking salad or whatever. So there's a lot of implicit trust in processes.
We have to ask ourselves, who is most harmed by HIV criminalization laws? Consistently, the answer is marginalized communities. Law enforcement in general is often racialized, and this is no exception. Additionally, poor people, incarcerated people, IV drug users, and sex workers are more likely to be exposed to HIV and thus criminalized for passing it on.
I actually think about this point a lot with respect to crime in general. I know we're a true political true crime podcast, so this point is very poignant for a lot of our cases. So if we take Max Weber's definition of a state being an entity with a monopoly on legitimate violence, then relying on a bourgeois colonial state to enforce HIV criminalization laws will inevitably mean a very disproportionate enforcement among various communities in that state. I also think this makes me skeptical of HIV criminalization purely based on how it would look in practice and who would enforce it. I mean, we can look at Toronto, for example, where recently there's been a lot of controversy because the police have been banned from marching in Pride, which, don't get me started on that, that's a whole other debacle altogether.
We should probably mention gay police officers can march in Toronto Pride, just not in like their police uniforms and stuff.
Yeah. So like, it's not like you're like all cops are banned. It's just you can't march as a cop. You can march as an individual person or part of a different collective. But the usual police float was removed from Pride a couple of years ago, and it's been an ongoing controversy since. And I mean, there's still a lot of mistrust between the queer community here, especially like the older community who remembers the bathhouse raids in the 60s and, that kind of thing. And even more recently, like the complete botched mishandling of the Bruce McArthur case, a serial killer who targeted gay people in the village.
And specifically gay men of color and recent immigrants and refugees.
People who he suspected correctly that no one would know they're gay, or no one would suspect, or like they're not out, and they completely botched it. Like there were fears about a serial killer targeting the village for a long time before the police caught this guy, to the point where one of and we could go into this at a future episode where we discuss this particular crime, of course, but one guy went to the police because Bruce McArthur tried to choke him out in his car, and he sort of shoved him off and ran away, and he filed a police report. And then Bruce McArthur went to the same police station and was like, yeah, sorry, I just thought he liked it rough, and, there was miscommunication there, and it's just like a misunderstanding. And the police were like, yeah, sure, okay, whatever, okay. And they didn't follow up at all with it. So to go back to what I was saying, I'm very skeptical of HIV criminalization because of what it would look in practice and who would enforce it. And I do think it's counterproductive to criminalize HIV in countries like the US, where no universal healthcare means A, HIV tests would cost a lot, B, treatment costs even more, and patients cannot be expected to seek treatment if they don't have insurance, can't afford the co-pays, can't afford the deductibles, hospitals don't have their coverage, all those sort of like nightmarish, archaic system that the US has.
And if policies hurt the very people that they claim to protect, and grassroots organizers in these communities, as well as medical professionals and academic experts, persistently emphasize decriminalization, I think that we should listen to them.
Absolutely, yeah.
It does go back, as you were saying, to the question of who is the law meant to protect and who is it meant to criminalize?
Yeah, I mean, to quote the great Alan Moore in his popular graphic novel Watchmen, who watches the Watchmen?
We hope at least that we have given you something to think about, especially regarding the space between criminal punishment and positive justice. We also want to give a thanks to our friend Antonio, who lent his medical expertise for this episode.
Yeah, so if you enjoy, subscribe, rate us on your podcast app of choice. Check out our Patreon at Das Criminal. And tell all your friends, tell your cult members, tell your pyramid scheme partners, tell everyone, really.
Yeah, we give some bonus content on our Patreon. I'd say you get probably like 66% more content if you subscribe to that. And you also get to vote on future episodes like this one.
Yeah, direct democracy ruled.
So we will be back on Monday with another episode.
Until next time, everyone. Bye.
Bye.